Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Steven here with Team Euphoric, and this is day 13 of the 80 Days to Your Dream Body course. Today's protein source is going to be beef brisket, and today's going to be a legs and abs training routine. And the theme for today's workout is going to be acute exercise variables. So right now, I'm going to be explaining how to manipulate sets, reps, intensity, time under tension, tempo, and rest periods for optimal results. Now let's get started. And while we are resting, let's discuss some acute exercise variables when you are writing a program that uses linear periodization. With regard to linear periodization, this is when your intensity starts out slow and then it ramps up, and your repetitions start high and they start to go down. With regard to sets, you're going to start low and then you're going to end high. Repetitions, you're going to start high, you're going to go low. With regard to intensity, you're going to start low, go high. With regard to the time under tension, you're going to have greater time under tension at the beginning, and then you're going to have a smaller time under tension toward the end of the program. With regard to your tempo, you want to increase things like positive and explosive concentric motions later on toward the periodization program. And with regard to rests, your rests are going to start off short in the beginning of the periodization, and then later towards the end of the linear periodization, you're going to develop longer rest periods. Let's take a look at how exactly this would look. With regard to linear periodization, let's come up with a 4-month plan right now. In 1 month, you could do something like 3 sets of 20 repetitions at 60% of your 1 repetition maximum and doing a 3-0-3-0 tempo. So let's say you're doing squats. You would go down for 3 and then immediately come up for 3. And then you could rest for something like 60 seconds. Then during month 2, you could do something like 4 sets of 12 repetitions at 70% of your 1 repetition maximum and follow a 4-0-2-0 tempo. So let's say again, you're doing squats. You go down for 4, you come up for 2. So that nice 2-to-1 ratio to elicit that hypertrophy response. And then you would rest for 90 seconds. Then during month 3, you could focus a little bit more on something like functional hypertrophy or absolute strength. That would be 5 sets of 8 repetitions at 75% of your 1 repetition maximum at a 3-2-1-0 tempo. So you could squat down for 3 seconds, pause at the bottom for 2 seconds, and then come up for 1 second. And that you would rest for something like 120 seconds. And then during month 4, you could focus on something like relative strength, where it's much higher intensity. You're going to be doing something like 6 sets of 5 repetitions at 85% of your 1 repetition maximum and a 4-0 exo tempo. So you're going down for 4 and then immediately exploding up as fast as you can. And then you could rest for something like 180 seconds. But those are the general recommendations for linear periodization. Our rest period is up. Time for set number 2. And while we are resting, let's discuss some acute exercise variable guidelines for undulating periodization. Undulating periodization is when you are alternating between periods of high volume, low intensity, and high intensity, low volume. Generally, you could refer to these as your accumulation phase. That's when you are accumulating volume at lower intensity, and your intensification phase, where you are increasing the intensity, but you are limiting the amount of volume that you are accumulating. Next, let's take a look at how exactly the acute exercise variables would play a role in undulating periodization. Generally, with regard to the sets, they're going to be lower in the accumulation phase and higher in the intensification phase. Your repetitions, those are going to be higher in the accumulation phase and lower in the intensification phase. Then, with regard to the intensity, obviously in the accumulation phase, the intensity is going to be lower. And as the name implies, in the intensification phase, your intensity is going to be much higher. Then, with regard to the time under tension, because we are doing very, very high intensity exercises during the intensification phase, during the accumulation phase, the time under tension is going to be longer. So your sets are going to last longer. And in the intensification phases, your sets are going to be much shorter because you're performing high intensity at fewer repetitions. With regard to tempo during the accumulation phase, you want to focus on more controlled concentric motions so you're not really exploding up. And then during the intensification phase, because we're going very, very heavy, we want to focus on some nice, slower eccentric contractions and also emphasize that explosiveness. That way we can generate a lot more force. With regard to rest periods, we're going to have shorter rest periods in the accumulation phase because we only need metabolic recovery. We're going to need to regain our energy and eliminate some of those byproducts like lactic acid. And then in the intensification phase, we're going to need a much longer recovery period because we're going to need that neural recovery, because during intensification phases, we're going to need a lot more motor control, things like balance, coordination. So that's going to be very important to get that nice long rest to get that full neural recovery. An example of how this would look in a program for an accumulation phase, you could do something like 4 sets of 12 repetitions at 70% of your 1 repetition maximum, and a 4-0-2-0 tempo, meaning you're going down for 4, coming up for 2, and resting 90 seconds at the end of the set. And then during an intensification phase, you could ramp up the intensity and do something like 5 sets of 8 repetitions at 85% of your 1 RM. You're going to do a 4-0-XO tempo, meaning you're going down for 4 and then exploding up as fast as you can. And then you could rest for something like 120 seconds. But our time is up. Time for set number 3. And while we're resting, let's discuss some acute exercise variable guidelines for block periodization. Block periodization is when you are focusing on one specific quality that you would like to enhance. With regard to athletic performance, this is going to be according to your biomotor abilities. There are 8 of them: speed, strength, power, endurance, flexibility, agility, coordination, and balance. So with regard to block periodization, the way that this would work is your sets are going to be much higher when you are doing something like strength, speed, and power. And then for endurance, they're going to be a lot lower. With regard to your repetitions, these are going to be much higher when you're training for endurance and much lower when you are training for things like speed, strength, and power. Your intensity is obviously going to be significantly higher if you are training for something like speed, strength, and power. And if you are training for endurance, the intensity is going to be very, very low. With regard to the time under tension, the greater the intensity, that means you're performing fewer repetitions. So for speed, strength, and power, it's going to be very, very short intervals. Whereas if you are working on endurance, it's going to be a much longer period for the actual set to take. So when you are performing endurance exercises, the sets are going to take you much longer than speed, strength, or power. Next, when we are taking a look at rest periods, when we are focusing on speed, strength, and power, we're going to need a lot of a longer rest period because we're going to need that neural recovery. If we don't get it, we're going to end up suffering because we're not going to have full coordination, balance, stability, motor control. So when we are doing something like endurance, that's really not going to be an issue. So when we are doing endurance training, we want the rest periods to be a lot lower. That way we can fatigue the muscle and bust through that actual plateau. So we want to be able to build up our endurance by being able to manage our fatigue while we are performing the exercises by minimizing the rest periods. The way this would look, let's say you are focusing on endurance training, you could do something like 3 sets of 20 repetitions at 60% of your 1 RM, and then do something like a 3-0-3-0 tempo. So there's a lot of tension on the muscle. Go down for 3, up for 3, and rest for 60 seconds. If you're focusing on something like hypertrophy, then you could do something like 4 sets of 12 repetitions at 70% of your 1 RM and do something like a 4-0-2-0 tempo. So you're going down for 4, up for 2, and resting for 90 seconds. Then if your goal is functional hypertrophy, so a little bit of hypertrophy, a little bit of strength, something like 5 sets of 8 repetitions at a 75% of your 1 RM with a 3-2-1-0 tempo. So you're going down for 3, pausing for 2, coming up for 1, and then resting for something like 120 seconds would be great. And then if you want to improve your relative strength, something like 6 sets of 5 repetitions at 85% of your 1 RM with a 4-0-XO tempo. So you're going down for 4 and then exploding up as fast as you can and resting for 180 seconds would be great. But rest period is up. Time for set number 4. And while we are resting, let's discuss acute exercise variable guidelines for somebody that has mixed goals. So let's say you are performing a workout, and within your workout, you don't want to focus just on one biomotor ability, but you want to focus a little bit on everything. In that type of workout, with regard to the sets, the exercises at the front end of the program, you would want to have more sets for those exercises because those are generally going to be your compound lifts. Then with regard to the repetitions, you are going to have more repetitions placed on the exercises toward the end of the program, because at the end of the program, that's generally going to be your isolation work, and your isolation exercises, that's going to be small single joint movements, so they're going to respond better to higher repetitions. With regard to the intensity, the high intensity exercises should be performed at the beginning of the program because those are going to be the exercises that require the most skill, coordination, and motor control. And then with regard to the time under tension, the sets at the beginning of the workout should be much shorter. The reason being is because we're doing high intensity exercises at the beginning, we're not going to be able to accumulate a lot of time under tension throughout those sets. Instead, we're focusing on intensity, not volume. With regard to the tempo, if you are going to be doing things like pauses or explosive movements, those should be done at the beginning when you're nice and fresh and you have the skill, coordination, and motor control to do those things. And then with regard to rest, you're going to be resting longer at the beginning because, again, the exercises at the beginning are going to be a lot more intense. So because they're more intense, you're going to require longer rest periods at the beginning of the program. Let's take a look at a leg routine. For example, let's say you wanted to do something like barbell back squats, dumbbell lunges, hamstring curls, and knee extensions. The way you could structure your program and the acute exercise variables for the barbell back squats, you could do something like 6 sets of 5 at 85% of your 1 repetition maximum and rest 180 seconds. Then you could progress to your dumbbell lunges where you do 5 sets of 8 repetitions at 75% of your 1 repetition maximum and rest for 120 seconds. Then move into your isolation work. You could do hamstring curls for 4 sets of 12 at 70% of your 1 repetition maximum and rest for 90 seconds. And then finish off with your knee extension exercises. Your knee extensors, those are going to be your tonic muscles. Those are going to be your slow twitch muscles. They respond better to higher repetitions. So you could do something like 3 sets of 20 at 60% of your 1 repetition maximum and rest for 60 seconds in between each set. But that is pretty much it. Our rest is up. Time for the 5th and final set. Thanks for sticking around until the end of the video. Be sure to like, share, and leave a comment as it'll help the algorithm. And if you enjoyed the content, show your support by subscribing to the channel by clicking on the icon in the bottom right corner. And if you really want to show your support, then consider becoming a member by clicking on the icon in the bottom left corner. These new high-quality videos aren't cheap to edit, and the $5 membership will really help with the video editing budget. You'll also get access to a ton of exclusive perks like early access to videos and this program design lecture playlist in the top right-hand corner. And if you want to learn how to do a one-armed pull-up, then check out the playlist on the top left corner.